God said, I don't accept your sacrifice. And when you look at the verse, it's pretty clear, I think. It says in verse 4, the Lord had respect unto Abel. So he respected Abel and his sacrifice. Do you see? He respected both Abel and the sacrifice. But in verse 5, it says, but unto Cain and to his offering, he had... See, unto Cain, he didn't respect Cain and his offering, because there was something, I think, that Cain was living in sin. He was doing something he shouldn't have been doing. And right away, as we read this verse, we can see kind of maybe part of what that was, at least. Now I'm going to ask you guys a question. If you had an opportunity to go before God, if you got to walk before God and say, God, I am going to give you a gift, like somebody gave you an opportunity to go and give God a gift, like the best thing that you had that you could offer to God, so you would please him. Now, if God saw your sacrifice that you were giving and he said, you know what, I don't respect this sacrifice, I don't respect you. Now, what do you think would be your response to that? Do you think you would say, well, God, that's not fair. Well, you should accept my sacrifice. Like, why won't you accept my sacrifice? Or do you think you'd say, oh, well, God, what can I do to be better? What can I do to come before you so that you will respect me? I think most of us understand that God has the right to be pleased or to be not pleased, right? Because he knows our hearts. He knows what's inside. He knows the things that we bring that other people can't see. Right? Now, what do you think Cain's answer was? Do you think Cain said, God, what can I do to improve? What can I do to be better? What can I do so that you will accept my sacrifice? He didn't do that. When we read verse 5, God rejected Cain and his offering. And then in the end of the verse it says, and Cain was very wroth. He was angry. He was angry that God didn't accept his sacrifice. And his countenance fell. Now to me, that almost sounds like he's sulking. We have quite a few whiners in the book of Genesis, it seems. Like a lot of these first guys were doing a bit of whining. God didn't accept Cain. He was hanging on to something in his life, and Cain's response was, it's just not fair. It's a little strange, isn't it? That's not the right attitude, if you ask me. Verse 6 says, and the Lord said unto Cain, why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? Why are you like this? Why are you feeling like this, Cain? What's wrong? Verse 7, if thou doest well, shalt thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door. So God said, if you do well, this kind of is a little bit more confirmation that Cain wasn't doing very well. There was something in his life, we don't know what it was, but there was something in there that he wasn't living the way God wanted him to live. But God said, Cain, if you do well, won't you be accepted? You will be. God was assuring him, if you do well, you will be accepted. But then he also gives him a warning. He says in that verse, in verse 7, he says, but if you don't do well, if you doest not well, sin lieth at the door. That's kind of a scary thought, isn't it? Just imagine you're in your house and you have the door there, and if you open the door, sin's just there waiting to pounce on you. That's kind of the way God explains sin here to Cain. He says, you got to be careful. Sin's waiting. It wants you. It wants to get you, Cain. You can't let it get you. He says in the end of verse 7, he says, and unto thee shall be his desire. That means sin wants you. It wants to get you. And it says, thou shalt rule over him. He's telling him, sin wants to get you, but you have to rule over the sin. You can't let it rule over you. It's waiting for you, Cain. It wants you. Now that's quite a strong warning, right, for Cain? And he obeyed, right? And they lived happily ever after, and he learned his lesson, and he brought another sacrifice, and it was accepted. Isn't that sad that the story couldn't have been happy? When, God gave him such a good chance, such good instruction, and he did not obey. We all know the story, right? Now, in verse 8, we don't know how much time passed. I kind of think that maybe it wasn't very much time, but that's just my opinion. I don't know that for sure. Verse 8, it says, and Cain talked with Abel his brother. So he's talking with him. And it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. He killed Abel his brother. Just imagine that jealousy that was stirring up inside him. God accepted Abel's sacrifice, but not mine. And that's just not fair. God warned me, but I just want it to be exactly the way I want it to be right now. He needs to accept me right now. Because he didn't, I'm just going to go kill my brother. And he killed Abel, his brother. Can you imagine that? He was not being a very obedient man. Now in verse 9, and the Lord said unto Cain, where is Abel thy brother? Did God have to ask Cain where his brother was? Of course not. God knew exactly where Abel was. But he's giving Cain an opportunity here, maybe even to repent and to show remorse for what he'd done. And again, Cain fails. He doesn't do the right thing. We don't know for sure if that was God's motive, but it kind of seems like it. And he said, that means Cain, he said, I know not. Am I my brother's keeper? No, I think this is the first example of sarcasm in the Bible. We're only 4 chapters in, and already somebody's just being sassy with God, talking back. Like sometimes we talk back to our parents, when we're being disobedient, and it's not a good thing. And already Cain's talking back to God. He's being sarcastic with God. When God's presenting a pretty serious issue to him, where's your brother, Cain? And Cain says, well, I don't know where he is. Am I supposed to keep track of my brother now on top of everything else, all my work? Verse 9, and the Lord, verse 10. And he said, this is God, what hast thou done? The voice of thy brother's blood crieth unto me from the ground. God says, I know what you've done, Cain. I know that you have killed your brother. His blood is crying to me from the earth. It was such a serious thing that had happened. And now art thou cursed from the earth, which hath opened her mouth to receive thy brother's blood from thy hand. Verse 12, when thou tillest the ground, it shall not henceforth yield unto thee her strength. A fugitive and a vagabond shalt thou be in the earth. And now because of what he had done, he's cursed. He was a farmer, so he was used to when he planted seeds, the earth would yield forth her strength to him. That's the way that God describes it here. So if he planted something and maybe he wanted to grow a fruit tree, like his parents told him about the garden, and he thought, it would be really nice to have some of that fruit. And if he planted a tree, it would grow, and he'd get to enjoy those things. It yielded its strength to him. And God cursed him, and he said, because of what you've done, that blood, it cries to me from the ground, and you're not going to yield the strength of the earth anymore. If you plant something, it won't grow for you. No more. You're going to be a fugitive in the earth. You're going to be running around forever. You're going to be a vagabond. That's kind of like I can't think of a good word for it. We'll just call it a vagabond. My mind's drawn a blank. But it's not a good thing, somebody who roams around and is a rascal. But God cursed him. And in verse 3, and Cain said unto the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Here we go again. He's whining again. Can you imagine that? God confronted him with his sin. He said, I know you've killed your brother. And he punished him. And instead of considering what he had done, all he could think about is himself. And he said, oh, woe is me. My punishment is so severe. I can't bear it. Instead of saying, oh God, I'm sorry for killing my brother. It was wrong of me. He was so concerned about himself. And here he is again. He's just whining. My punishment is greater than I can bear. He says in verse 14, behold, thou hast driven me out this day from the face of the earth, and from thy face shall I be hid. And I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond in the earth, and it shall come to pass that everyone that findeth me shall slay me. Now, here's a question for you. If God had made Adam and Eve, and then Adam and Eve now had 2 sons, well, if he sent Cain out and Cain is roaming around, who would there be who are the people that he's talking about that are going to kill him? Do we know? This is another question that I kind of struggled with for a long time, and I wondered, well, who could these people be that he's talking about here? And I wasn't sure if there was already people roaming around, and he was just afraid that he was going to run into somebody right away who was going to kill him. But, I don't think that's the case. And I think we can get some answers from Scripture. So I think what Cain means here, and also what God said, I think he's talking about the people that are going to be there in the future. Because I think he knew that at some point in time there was going to be more people that were going to go out from Adam and Eve, and they were going to find Cain. I don't think that there was people yet that were going to be around there, because Cain was going to be a fugitive and a vagabond, but I believe that he was alone at first, other than his wife. In verse 15, it says, And the Lord said unto him, Therefore, whoever slayeth Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord set a mark upon Cain, lest any finding him should kill him. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. So he set a mark on Cain, and he gave a command. And he said, If anyone kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. Now, here's my question. If there was already people roaming around in the earth, how would they know about that command? They might see the mark on Cain, but how would they know what it meant? They wouldn't know what it meant, right? Unless God had revealed it to them somehow, but I don't think that's the case. Do you know what I think happened? Now, you might want to talk to your parents and maybe get them to confirm these things for you, because this is just my opinion. So you just have to take it for what it's worth. I could be wrong. But I think what happened here is God gave a command, and he was also kind of giving the command to Adam and Eve in a way. So he was going to God put a mark on Cain, but then when he sent Cain out, well now, every time Adam and Eve had other children in the future and they were going to go forth out into the world as well, he would have said, now you got to keep an eye out for Cain. He killed his brother, but you can't take vengeance on him. God said, if you kill Cain, you'll be avenged sevenfold on you. God will take vengeance on you. And he said, look for this mark. If there's a mark on this man, don't kill him. God said, you can't kill him. So I think Adam and Eve, whenever they had future generations, they told them. And they would have all known the story about Cain who killed his brother. And if they ran into him in the world, then they would know who he was and to make sure not to take his life. So that's kind of the way that I view that. Make sure you can check with your parents and see if I'm right, because there's a chance that I'm wrong. We're going to keep reading here. And Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived, and bare Enoch, and he builded a city and called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. So, now the question is, where did Cain get his wife? There's lots of questions in this one, right? Back when God first made Adam and Eve, and they had children, there was nobody else to have children with, so they actually married their sisters. It doesn't say here that Adam and Eve had sisters, but I think we can understand later it says that they bear sons and daughters, so they had more children. But it was later, God actually didn't make that rule until later. When they were first replenishing the earth, the only people they could marry were their sisters. But later on, God said, now you can't do that anymore. Later on in the Bible, he said you can't marry your sisters anymore. But in the beginning, those were the only people there was. But Cain, when he left, it sounds like he took a wife with him, and he started to have children and build cities in different places. Now, I do want to skip ahead and just think about one thing. In the beginning of the second chapter, it says that after this happened, after all this happened with Cain and Abel, that Adam and Eve, that they had another son named Seth. Now, do you know how old they were when they had Seth? It actually says that Eve was comforted by having Seth. So it kind of sounds like pretty much right after these things happened with Cain and Abel, that she had another son named Seth. Now, who can guess how old they were? I'm not going to read it, I just want you to guess. How old do you think they would be when they had their third son? Now think about this. I've had my fifth child and I'm 32. So how old, and plus, I was a baby once. They were never babies. So how old do you think that they would be when they had their third son?
About like 100 years.
That's a really good guess, actually. I'm surprised. If I had to guess, I would have thought that all this happened in a few years, like maybe 20 years or 30 years. But in the 5th chapter, it actually says when she had Seth, Adam and Eve were 130 years old. So they were already old. 130 years had passed, plus a week, since God had made the heavens and the earth. And now there was Cain roaming around, and Abel was dead, and they had another son. So it doesn't actually tell us when they had Cain and when they had Abel and when Abel was murdered, but that all happened sometime, I kind of think maybe somewhere around like when they were 90 to 130, somewhere in there, but we actually don't know. But we're just going to read through the rest of the chapter, and this is kind of just talking about what happened with what happened with Cain and his descendants. And it kind of gives us a bit of an insight into when some of these things were made, like when musicians started to come into the world and things like this. So in verse 18, and unto Enoch was born Irad, and Irad begat Mehujael, and Mehujael begat we'll see if I can spit it out. Methusael, and Methusael begat Lamech. And Lamech took unto him 2 wives. The name of one was Ada, and the name of the other Zillah. And Ada bare Jabal, and he was the father of such as dwell in tents, and of such as have cattle. So he was a cattleman. He was a cowboy, the first cowboy. And his brother's name was Jubal, and he was the father of all such as handle the harp and the organ. So, Jubal, he was the first one who started playing at least these type of instruments, the people that play stringed instruments. And the organ, I'm not 100% sure what he means. I don't think it was the same type of organ that we would know as an organ, but he was the father of those type of instruments. We're almost done, guys. And Zillah, she also bore Tubal Cain, an instructor of every artificer in brass and iron. So now here's the person who came up with working with metal. It didn't take very long for these things to happen. And all of a sudden, they know how to use metal and things like that, and they work with metal. And the sister of Tubal Cain was Naamah. And Lamech said unto his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, ye wives of Lamech. Hearken unto my speech, for I have slain a man to my wounding, and a young man to my hurt. If Cain shall be avenged sevenfold, truly Lamech 70 and sevenfold. Well, here we have somebody who knew about Cain. He knew that the story was still getting passed down. They knew you can't slay Cain because you'll be avenged sevenfold. But he says, now I've killed somebody, and I'm going to be avenged 70 and sevenfold. Now, I don't know what this means. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't completely understand this story. There's probably something here that I don't know, but it's a mystery to me. So maybe you'll have to ask your parents about that one. It says, And Adam knew his wife again, and she bare a son, and called his name Seth. For God, said she, hath appointed me another seed instead of Abel, whom Cain slew. And to Seth, to him also there was born a son, and he called his name Enos. Then began men to call upon the name of the Lord. Well, that's all we're going to get to today, kiddos. So if you want to have a seat, you all sat very nice. Thank you for listening.